Send your scariest workplace stories to us at eeriecast.com/submit and rate and review Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Look, I hate to be that guy, but if you don't have the decency to die and take your spirit with you when you go, well, that's just rude. Too many workplaces these days are all haunted up by employees who just couldn't help themselves after dying. Heck, even Dead and Roasted has around 13 ghosts at least. I keep finding strange white ectoplasm on the coffee beans. Still a mystery. Speak of the devil, today's episode features an assortment of new scary work stories about haunted offices, ghostly shifts, and sharp-toothed things waiting by your car. These are Tales from the Break Room. Overnight Shifts from Heebiegi. I work the overnight shift, and for the purpose of anonymity, I'll just say that the place I work at has clientele that lives on the property 24/7. My job is basically to watch over them while they sleep, in case of emergency or if they need medication or try to leave the property, and to make sure the buildings don't burn down. There are 4 buildings on 11 acres of land. While all of these buildings are fairly close together, I still have to walk from building to building in the dark to do bed checks. The majority of the 11 acres are woods with walking trails. It is very creepy in there at night. Thankfully, that's not where my story takes place. This story takes place between 2 of the 4 buildings. One building is an office with 3 rooms, the other building a 3-bed, 2-bath house. This house is where some of the clients slept. I spent much of my time in the office, doing whatever I wanted to do, specifically watching anime and making art. There is a short path between the office and that house. I'm talking about 40 feet long. I would go into the house to check on the clients, use the restroom, there's not one in the office, and prepare any food I brought to eat. This property has been rumored to have ghosts. Clients and staff alike had seen them. Usually a woman and a young boy. They were only seen on this side of the property. The other 2 buildings do not seem to have any activity. There's also a rumor that clients that sleep in a specific bedroom in the house begin to change. They grow irritable, depressed, and just altogether unhappy. Change the room and voila, they feel better. Not sure how true that part is. Next to the office building is a beautiful garden. It has a big log fence around it, but it's the kind that is wood and wire, so you can easily see into it when standing outside. It's mainly used to keep out the deer, as they love to munch on the veggies. The wildlife in the area is abundant. Now that I've set up the scene, I'll tell you about the 3 specific things I have experienced while working on that side of the property. They're not the only 3. However, they are definitely the most interesting and terrifying. One night, I was in the house gathering my food to take back over to the office. I was quite excited to eat my snacks and watch this new anime movie that had recently come out. I'll say without shame that as I left the house, my arms were full of snacks. I was balancing bags of chips, fruit, and other things at the same time. I stepped out onto the short path between the buildings and began to make my way to the office. Suddenly, a strange feeling came over me. I am not unfamiliar with the paranormal, nor am I unfamiliar with the fight or flight or freeze reaction. In this moment, I felt fear ripple through my body. I stopped in the middle of the path and couldn't move anymore. I remember looking all around me, trying to figure out why I was feeling the way I did. That's when I saw it, or him, standing in the middle of the garden, behind the fence. It was a man. He was illuminated by a couple of floodlights we have on the property, and despite being illuminated, he was completely black. I could not make out any features, except that he was wearing a hat, like a top hat or maybe a cowboy hat. As soon as my eyes landed on this figure, my heart dropped past my stomach and into my knees. The feeling that came from this figure was anger, rage. Fight or flight kicked in within an instant, and the only thing my brain could process was the instinct to run. So that's what I did. I sprinted the last 20 feet to the door, where I actually slammed into it because I had locked it when I left earlier. I don't remember getting out my keys or unlocking the door. I don't remember if I dropped my snacks or brought them in. What I do remember is being inside and slamming the door shut. Then I locked it. I was panting, covered in sweat and goosebumps. I inwardly laughed at myself. Lock the door, really? If that was a ghost, he would just get in somehow. I leaned on the door, breathing hard, when I suddenly thought, my God, the clients. Isn't it my job to ensure their safety? I'd left them alone sleeping in that house with that thing in the garden. It's in the garden, and it's bad. I could not deny that feeling. After briefly mulling over my options, which were slim, I decided I needed to go back into the house. I gathered myself mentally, unlocking the office door and sprinting down the path to the house. I opened the front door and practically threw myself inside. I locked the door behind me and immediately went to the window. After peering out, looking into the garden, I didn't see anything. I sat in the middle of the couch, facing the front door and waiting. The front door was thick wood, but it did have a large glass cutout in the middle. I spent the entire night staring out that glass, too paranoid to move. Nothing else happened that night. Only when the sun began to rise did I start to ease up. I haven't felt fear like that since. The next incident also took place near and around the garden. It was a typical quiet night. I was in the office that sits adjacent to the garden. One room has a window that looks out partially into the garden, then partially outside of it. I was having a snack and watching a show on my laptop when I thought I heard something coming from outside. My first thought was it was a client who needed something. I paused my show and stood up. That's when I realized what I heard was singing. It was quiet, soft, and even childlike. This gave me pause, as we certainly do not have child clients around here. I listened for a few more seconds before I decided to peer out the window. Nothing. The floodlights were on and I saw nothing out of the ordinary. But I could still hear the singing. Like a typical idiot in a scary movie, I went outside to investigate. After all, it was my responsibility to keep the residents safe. Poking my head out the door and looking both ways, I gingerly stepped out the door. I made a short loop in front of the building and garden, but I saw nothing, and the singing was gone. I made my way into the house down the short path to make sure everyone was accounted for. Yep, all there. Once I returned to the building, I sat back down to continue snacking and watching my show. However, as soon as I sat down, the singing started back up. I didn't move for some time, maybe just a minute or two, but it felt much longer than that. At one point, I realized I was crying. There were tears streaming down my face, and initially, I was not conscious of it. I sat there crying silently, again probably for only a minute or two, but it felt way longer. It was a bizarre cry, as it didn't feel like I was the one doing it, but clearly I was. My face was soaked with tears, and the tears were obscuring my vision. I don't really recall how that night ended. The final incident worth recounting took place in the house where the residents live, across from the garden and office. I was training a new girl for the overnight shift, joking with the other staff about not telling her about the ghosts in hopes she wouldn't immediately quit. Well, turns out I didn't have to tell her anything about them. They made themselves quite clear. We were doing a property walkthrough and bed checks like normal. There was a stuffed animal on the floor of the living room that a client gave to the resident dog. I was used to seeing that stuffed squirrel tossed everywhere and anywhere, so I barely registered it as we walked to the client rooms. We checked beds, then went back outside, so I could show her more of the property. We were gone for maybe 3 minutes before returning to the house. When we walked back in, I realized the stuffed squirrel was not in the same place. Now it was by the dining room table. Maybe I'm remembering wrong, I thought. I hesitated before asking my new coworker, "Hey, did that stuffed animal move?" She was quiet for a moment before responding, "Yeah." We looked at each other and I felt goosebumps race up on my skin. Acknowledging what happened but trying to move on, we sat at the living room couch so I could show her some work on the computer. I briefly went to the kitchen to get a drink. The kitchen has a little counter, and if standing by the counter you can see over the living room couch and into the living room itself. I looked down to pour my drink when I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. The trainee gasped, shouting, "It moved! Oh my God, it just moved!" I looked up and sure enough, that stuffed squirrel was now about 10 feet away from its last position. My coworker had not gotten up from the couch, and while I didn't directly see it, I did catch something moving in my peripheral. She luckily didn't quit that night, but she didn't really last long. Unseen Factory Door from Golden Moon. I was once a security guard at a remote factory in South Africa, and what I experienced during my time there still haunts my dreams to this very day. It was a sprawling facility nestled deep within the dense thicket of the Western Cape province, far from any town or city. The job seemed like an easy way to make a living, but I could have never anticipated the horrors that awaited me. My duties were simple: patrol the perimeter, ensure no trespassers entered, and keep an eye on the eerie machinery that loomed over the factory floor. The factory was abandoned, and its machines stood frozen in time, covered in a thick layer of dust and decay. My only companions were the soft hum of the generator, rustling leaves, and the ever-present sense of isolation. The first few nights on the job were uneventful, aside from that unsettling stillness. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice strange occurrences that defied explanation. It started with peculiar noises in the dead of night. I would hear footsteps echoing through the empty halls, doors creaking open, whispers that sounded like they were just beyond the edge of my hearing. I tried to dismiss them as my mind playing tricks on me, but the fear was growing inside me like a cancer. One night I patrolled the factory floor when I saw this shadowy figure dart behind a pile of rusted machinery. My heart raced, and I approached cautiously, ready to confront a potential intruder. But when I reached the spot, there was nothing there. It was as if the darkness had swallowed the intruder whole. I radioed my supervisor, telling him about these strange sightings, but he dismissed my concerns, chalking it up to my imagination getting the best of me.
"It's just an old abandoned factory. You're alone out there and your mind can play tricks on you,"
he said. I tried to convince myself he was right, but fear had taken hold, and I could not shake the feeling I was being watched, that something sinister lurked in the shadows. These encounters only grew more bizarre and terrifying. On another night, I spotted a flickering light in one of the factory's windows. As I drew closer to it, I could see the glow of an old television set, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the room. I cautiously approached the window and peered inside. What I saw still sends shivers down my spine. It was a room filled with outdated TV sets, all displaying static, but with a common thread. They all showed footage of the factory itself, from different angles and at different times. I couldn't understand how this was possible. There should be no electricity in this factory. The generator only provided power to a few essential lights. I decided to investigate this room, my heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and dread. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me, and I was plunged into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled for my flashlight, and when I finally turned it on, the room was empty, the TV sets now powered down. I forced my way out of the room, running back to my security booth, where I radioed my supervisor again, pleading with him to send someone to relieve me. But my pleas fell on deaf ears, and I was told to stay put and stop making up stories. Night after night, the strangeness continued. I would hear the disembodied laughter of children echoing through the halls, the sounds of footsteps running up and down staircases that led to nowhere, and voices whispering in languages I could not understand. The factory had become a twisted labyrinth of the supernatural, and I was trapped in the middle of it. One evening, as I patrolled the factory floor, I stumbled upon a room I had never noticed before. The door was half concealed by shadow, and I hesitated before entering. Inside, I found a collection of old photographs scattered across a table. They depicted a group of people in the factory, workers wearing outdated uniforms, their faces twisted in fear and anguish. As I examined the photos, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the lone candle on the table. Darkness enveloped me, but then I felt a presence in the room, a malevolent force sending a chill down my spine. I had to run. I left the photographs behind in a hurry, but the memory of those tormented faces haunted me. My nights at the factory had become a living nightmare. I was tormented by the unexplained and the incomprehensible. I had reached the brink of my sanity, and I knew I couldn't endure much longer. One night, as I sat in my security booth, I heard a series of blood-curdling screams coming from deep within the factory. These voices were familiar, the same ones I had heard in the photographs. I couldn't ignore them. I had to go see. Armed with a flashlight and a trembling hand, I made my way to the source, which led me to the factory's basement, a place I had avoided until now. As I descended the creaking stairs, the air grew cold, and a pervasive sense of dread settled over me. In the dim light of my flashlight, I discovered a chamber hidden in the depths of the basement. And there I saw them. A group of figures, the same people from the photographs, suspended from the ceiling by chains. Their eyes were hollow and empty. They swayed back and forth, their screams echoing in the dark chamber. I couldn't believe what I was looking at, but I felt compelled to free them. As I approached, these figures turned towards me, their faces contorted in anguish, and they mouthed silent pleas for help. The chains holding them seemed to defy physics, as if anchored by an unseen force. I reached for my radio, my hands trembling, and called for help. My supervisor finally showed up, accompanied by a small team of other guards. They looked at me, confused. They could not see the horror that surrounded us. As they approached the ghostly figures, I watched in terror, as their eyes could not see those tortured souls. The guards were not aware of it at all, and yet those figures reached out to them, spectral hands passing through them. To this day, I can't escape the nightmares and the memories of working at that factory. The things I witnessed, the torment I endured, they're etched into my soul, and I don't think I can ever truly be free from them. South Africa's remote factory may have been abandoned by the previous owners, but the spirits of the old factory workers still haunts the place. I've since resigned from the security company, and I'm looking for other work that doesn't require the night shift. And whoever they found to replace me, I wish you good luck. Workplace Pervert from Marshellette. My story happened before the Me Too hashtag movement, before it was acceptable for women to call out their perverted bosses, like Harvey Weinstein, and warn other women on the internet of their depravity, when many pervs could get away with their harassment. I worked at a large event center at the time, setting up tables and cleaning floors and toilets. Try cleaning a toilet after 500 people have used it in the days before social distancing. Talk about a horror story in itself. But the center of my story includes a pervy and menacing boss, on par with Harvey Weinstein himself. I have another female to verify that he was indeed a weirdo. My friend and coworker I'll call Pam. Rick was the name of our perverted boss, a short, stabby little name. Rick the Prick, as Pam and I privately called him. Rick had been married 3 or 4 times and had 6 kids. Word was, Rick the Prick had yet again recently divorced and was on the prowl. Rick always kept a comb in the pocket of his overly tight black jeans and would reach out and comb his hair periodically, keeping his shiny black hair in place. He called himself a woman magnet, but he actually repulsed women. Sometimes one of Rick's multiple former wives would show up at the event center, demanding unpaid child support. But Rick the Prick would always try to hide from them, or pretend he wasn't there. "Tell them I'm not home," was his motto. One dark night, as Pam and I were cleaning up after a large event, Rick spilled a Coca-Cola on his tight black jeans and beckoned us to come over. Menacingly gripping a dirty mop handle, Rick lunged for a stack of napkins and threw them at Pam and I, screaming at us to clean it up, referring to the coke on his private parts. No?" Pam and I both echoed. For the rest of the night, as we scraped him off the linoleum, we tried to avoid Rick the Prick. But it wasn't over yet. When I reported Rick for harassment to our boss didn't believe me. "Rick is a good-looking guy. Women love Rick," he said. Even when Pam seconded and confirmed the story, the boss would not listen. Then at some point, Rick dropped a napkin on my desk with his phone number on it while I was trying to eat in the employee break room. "Those are my digits," Rick said. "Call him if you ever want a job as my private secretary." I never took Rick up on his offer, as I surmised that being a private secretary would mean mopping up coke from Rick's private parts. Pam and I changed jobs soon after. Rick was only getting braver, and there's no telling what kind of harassment he had in store next. Nighttime Stroll from Sarah C. I'm a basically blind 30-something female, and I live in England. This happened to me between 2010 and 2014. I was doing night shifts back then. I worked for a company who shall remain nameless. Suffice to say that the sites we worked at were very secure. Swipe cards, alarms, all that stuff. For a bit of background, I used to work 6 days on, then I'd have 4 off. 7 a.m. to 5 p.m., 1 p.m. to 11 p.m., and the night shifts 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. These were often the hardest for obvious reasons, because of the difficulty of staying awake. I'll admit I did fall asleep a few times. One night, during an 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, I think it was about 2 a.m., we suddenly got an announcement over the public address system that we were going into lockdown. Bear in mind, it's obviously a skeleton crew on nights, and, incidentally, that was the first and only time the PA went off at night. Immediately, our supervisor sprang into action, informing us that the doors were locked and we could not get out of the building, and of course, no one could enter either. Being totally blind and a female, I was instantly trying not to panic. Sure, I was surrounded by colleagues, but the doors were locked. It was about 2 a.m., and no one knew what was going on. Next thing we knew, There were people with guns walking around the site to protect us, and there was a helicopter overhead. We knew then that the situation was indeed serious. We didn't know if it was an active shooter or something else. The supervisor's phone kept ringing, and she was given updates. Eventually, though, she told us that what had happened was someone high up in the same company, but a different area, was staying on the site overnight, and had for some random reason known only to them, decided to go for a walk at 2 a.m. On the site I worked on, that's not a good idea. We were all instantly relieved, but a bit angry too. They'd scared all of us, and for no obviously good reason. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when he was told this by someone in authority. Needless to say, I'm sure he won't be doing that again anytime soon. Black Friday. From J. Perez. I was working at Hugo Boss at the Jersey Gardens Mall on Black Friday 2018. Dealing with the rush of customers in the tiny store was no easy task, but we had a good rhythm going. By then, I'd been working retail for 6 years, so I was no stranger to the stress of the most demanding weekend in retail. But the system we had in place seemed to be working, and all seemed to be going well. As the second manager in charge, I was as happy as one can be in that situation, especially since we worked on commission, and the lines seemed to never end. Register pings, drawers opening, customer-employee exchanges, and fitting room doors opening and closing were all normal sounds registering in my ears. Until there was a loud bang, followed by people in the hall running and screaming. I could only have recognized those sounds so quickly since we had a similar incident the year prior. My adrenaline kicked in as I glanced over to the manager in charge, who had a blank expression on his face. Instead of waiting for him to react, I signaled to all employees, about 5 in total, and customers, around 7 to 10 in total, that remained in the store to go to the far end behind most of the fixtures. I grabbed the bar to close the gate, which would provide very little coverage from an active shooter, should one have decided to use our store for target practice. As we crouched down and continued to see everyone running outside, I tried to determine which direction they were running from to assess where the shooter was. All I really knew was that the shot sounded close. All I could think about was wanting to go home to my husband of 2 months, and how a stray bullet would have no trouble piercing through the thin plaster walls between the stores. We eventually moved to the stockroom in the back, which had access to the manager's computer and phone. We checked for news coverage online and phoned family to let them know we were okay, since the incident seemed to be on every major news outlet. We tried to keep the customers relaxed, but we couldn't really get clear information on what was happening. For example, we had no idea if there was one or multiple shooters. We were there for what felt like an hour, when we finally noticed armed officers on the security monitors securing the hallway. I slowly approached the gate while announcing myself, so as not to startle the SWAT team. I asked how much longer we would have to stay. They said they were clearing the mall and would let us know when it was safe to leave. After another long wait, we were at last given the go-ahead. As we let the customers out, we stayed back to secure the store, but we barely spoke. Our adrenaline had worn off, leaving us with a sense of relief, but also sadness that we had to go through this in the first place. On the way to my car, I noticed the floor littered with receipts, bags, even a gift card or two. Things people must have dropped in their rush to escape. I pictured being caught in that stampede towards the exit. I still remember getting to my car and crying until I got home. The helplessness I felt was all-consuming. In the end, one man was shot in the wrist, just a few stores down from Hugo Boss. I'm unsure if the shooter was ever caught. All I know is I still get panic attacks when I see a crowd hurrying in the same direction, like in a train station. I'm just glad I left retail a few months after that traumatic day. Slasher at Target. From Anonymous. This happened about a year ago at my local Target. My mom was feeling sick and needed a ride to the store. Trying to be the good daughter I was, I told her to get in my car and we headed out. It was only a quarter mile from where we lived, so it was no big deal, and we frequented there for our weekly shopping anyway. It was almost 10, so we planned to just grab the few things we needed and run out, so as to not hold up the store staff. My mom wasn't feeling too great, so I insisted on dropping her off at the front while I went to park. I dropped her off and pulled into the first parking spot I saw, which was near a few other cars that were there. I immediately saw a large group of people standing near where I parked. Warning bells went off in my head, but I ignored them and just turned off my car and planned to just run inside to find my mom. I locked the car the moment I opened my door, and I saw that there were a few adults there and a bunch of teenagers. A woman with a baby strapped to her chest right away approached me, tears in her eyes.
"Can you help me? I need some money for my baby."
Taken aback and quite uncomfortable with so many people watching me, especially near my car, I hesitated. "I'm sorry, I don't have any cash. I have to go." It was true, I didn't have any cash on me, no change at all, and I just rushed inside after my mom. I found her getting chicken noodle soup and we grabbed what we needed before heading to the checkout. The store was completely empty, aside from a few employees up front. After paying, we grabbed our bags and walked out of the store. The group of beggars still on my mind, I wondered if they would be waiting for me to return. Luckily, when we got back, they had left. But I did see them walking towards the street as we headed to my car. I told my mom about what happened, and she gave me such a scared look, making me promise I would never go to the store at night by myself. I did and assured her nothing happened, and that she just needed to worry about herself. We made it home without a hitch. She took some cold medicine before we both went to bed. Come morning, I went out to the car to leave for work. There, I found one of my tires completely flat. I called a tow truck and got it taken to the Goodyear nearby. They told me I'd run over a pothole at a high speed, and that had done it. So I thought nothing more of it, except that I have no memory of doing such a thing. About 10 or so minutes later, I got a call from Goodyear. They told me they found exactly what caused the flat tire. A slash from a knife. Someone had cut my tire. I felt goosebumps rush up my arms and a chill. It had to have been someone from Target that night. I remembered a man had been giving me a furious glare as I told that woman that I didn't have any money. He'd looked like he was ready to kill someone. There was no question in my mind at that moment that one of them had had a knife, and if I'd stayed a minute longer, he would have killed me. It was dark that night. For all I know, he already had it out, ready to slice me up for whatever he could rob from me. My mom, upon hearing this, immediately went back to Target, reporting the incident to the manager. To this day, none of those people have been caught. For anyone out there looking to kill for your own gain, let's never meet. Stare Down. From Squishycat. It was fall in the beautiful state of Colorado. I lived in an apartment complex a good few miles from work. At this point, I was living with my now ex-husband. Let's just say we're all young and dumb at some point. There were a lot of missing pet posters around our mailboxes lately. I mean, missing pet posters weren't abnormal, but lately there were many, many more than usual. Mostly people's cats that had gotten out, or the occasional dog. The issue was that this time, they were posted almost all at the same time. That fact was creepy in and of itself. I got up and started my day like any other. I woke up at 3 a.m., got ready to be at work by 4 a.m., and I walked out the front door, going down the stairs to where my car was parked, which was across from the dumpsters. Now, I'd lived in that complex for 2 years at that point, so I knew it pretty well. Sure, we had the usual raccoons and smaller animals running about, but after walking around the corner from one of the buildings, I suddenly felt my heart sink right into my stomach. Behind my car was what I thought was a coyote, another normal sight almost anywhere in Colorado. But this was no normal coyote. It was taller. The head didn't look right, almost like its skull had been crushed on one side. I grew up in the countryside. I've seen coyotes with all kinds of afflictions, rabies, mange, distemper, you name it. But this thing was no coyote. Its legs were too long, its body disfigured, almost like its spine had been twisted 180 degrees. Standing where I was on the sidewalk, I watched it turn its attention towards me, and I instantly thought I was about to die. I stood there staring at it, and it stared right back. I'm not unfamiliar with supernatural things. I think I've had my fair share. But while this thing and I were having a staring contest, I watched as it walked away from my car and made its way down the road. I saw it turn out of the complex. I was finally able to bring myself to walk to the car, quickly getting it unlocked. I climbed in and started the car. As I headed in the direction the creature went, to get out onto the main road, the thing was gone. But how? How could this creature just disappear like that? There was a field, but surely I would have been able to see it cross, since it was small and my car lights illuminated it. But instead, I saw nothing. I didn't tell anyone because, truthfully, I thought I was just going crazy. I spoke with a coworker who lived in another complex. They told me I wasn't the only one who had seen it. Weeks earlier, they had come across the same thing after working a late shift. The only difference was that what they saw had something in its jaws, while what I saw didn't. I tried to ask my now ex-husband if we could move, but I was told no, as rent there was cheaper. To this day, I don't know what I saw. And every time I hear coyotes crying and yipping, I feel a wave of dread wash over me. I will not be outside after certain times of the day or night. It Played Dead, from Cherrytea. It was a cold November morning in around 2018. I was 17 years old at the time, driving to work. I lived in a rural suburban area of my town, surrounded by deer, horses, and bobcats. They were no stranger to me. They were also no stranger to being roadkill. This was in Colorado. The sun sets at about 5 o'clock in winter and rises at about 7 a.m. At the moment, it was light outside, but overcast. I was driving down the road I lived on when I saw a large black mass lying in the street. To be honest, I thought someone just dumped another bag of trash in the middle of the road, so I went to carefully drive by it, until I saw it breathing. I slowed down and took a closer look. I saw limbs and ears. Now, I've seen too many horror films to make one of those mistakes, so I was not about to get out of my car. Even so, I was curious. Wouldn't you be? Surely it couldn't be dead. It was still breathing. I didn't put two and two together until later, because I wasn't quite sure what I was looking at. It looked like a bear, but very, very skinny. But then I watched it prop itself back up on its hands that looked like human hands, wielding sharp claws. It had a canine-looking snout, but human-like eyes. It bared its teeth at me, and I snapped back to reality, smashing on the gas, swerving to avoid colliding with the mass. It began to chase me. At this time, I was speeding, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, it was somehow gone. I never did see it again, and I'm sure happy as heck I haven't. The Runner, from Night Stalker 84. In 2005, I was working as a gym attendant in a small hotel near Steps, just outside Glasgow. One night, I was closing up at about 10 p.m. I was making my way down to the main door to make my way out and lock it up when I got this strong feeling of being watched. I started to feel extremely scared, and I had the urge to turn around, so I did. That was when I saw a white mass at the top of the hallway, which began to rush towards me. I turned and very quickly closed and locked the main door before running to my dad's car. As soon as I sat down, he said to me, "Whoa, you look like you've seen a ghost." To which I replied, "I think I did." The following day, I went back to work. That night, when it got dark, I started to try and work out what I'd seen. I looked at the lights and the shadows. I watched for cars coming past the window. I watched to see if they would recreate what I'd seen, but nothing seemed to do it. A couple of days after that, when I was working, someone had an accident in the gym. I was filling out the accident book when I noticed a prior entry. Someone 2 years back had suffered a fatal heart attack on the treadmill and died before the ambulance arrived. It was 2 years to the day of my experience. Did I perhaps see the tortured soul of that poor person, trapped in the gym, unable to leave? All I know is it was one of those few times in my life that I've been genuinely terrified. It's a Creepy World, from San. This nail-biting story took place in Chicago in 2002. I only lived in Chicago for 3 years, and I have many stories from there that could probably fill a whole episode. I was a young man in my mid-20s. I was working at a sandwich shop making sandwiches for hungry customers. Around 8 p.m. one night, which was closing time, a man in his mid-40s with scraggly hair and smelling of some type of drug came into the store stumbling like a drunk. He staggered in, rudely asking for a foot-long meatball sub. He also added to hurry it up or he would break our necks. At this point, I just thought he was a weirdo. How wrong could I possibly have been? We give him his sandwich and he stumbles out. At this time, we started to lock up, and we noticed that this drunken lunatic was pressing his face against one of the windows. We started to panic and called 911, reporting the incident. The operator said that the officers would arrive within 20 minutes. We didn't even have time to flinch because that crazy freak broke the glass. 2 people standing nearby who had been watching this were cut in multiple places from the glass shards. The police were only 10 minutes away, but we had to find a way to keep him out of the store for everyone's safety. Thankfully, one of my coworkers found a metal bar and bashed him on the head when he tried to get in. The blows seemed to knock him out long enough for the cops to come and arrest him. He was forced to pay a fine to fix the glass. Then he served 2 years in prison for unrelated issues. If you work in the fast food industry, keep an eye on those you think might be on something, because you never know what they might do. 2 stories from AmmeJeanRomeo. Something Fell. This is a short account of something strange I witnessed not too long ago. I was sitting in a meeting with some colleagues at my workplace. All of a sudden, we heard a loud bang. It was so loud, we all felt the vibrations go through us. Immediately, the 2 male colleagues in the room rushed out to check the stairs and the nearby vicinity. We assumed someone had fallen and gotten hurt. Everyone in the building had heard it, but there was no signs of anyone having fallen. One of my colleagues even hurried outside to check the roof and the grounds. We even feared that a student or staff member had jumped off the roof. I work at a university, if you're wondering. None of us could work out what had caused the noise, and so we continued the rest of the meeting in a subdued manner. A little while later, the office manager popped her head into the room. As it turns out, one of the paintings in the reception area had fallen off the wall, the source of the bang. It was a relief to know nothing terrible had happened. I also commend the quick action of my colleagues to check if anyone was hurt. But it's a sad thing that one of our immediate assumptions was that someone may have jumped to their death. We live in a world of unimaginable horror and suffering, so much so that our minds jump to horrible worst-case scenarios. Take care of yourselves and those around you, as that assumption could one day turn out to be true. Office Ghost. I recently started a new job, working as an administrator at a university. The building I work in is pretty old and small, having been built about 50 years ago when the university opened. When I go to work, I enter the building through a side door, which leads up a flight of stairs. From there, I then go through a door, needing a passkey for entry. Once through the door, I enter a long hallway with the staff kitchen and toilets immediately to my right. Then, dotting along the corridor in both directions, are various meeting/office rooms. My office is roughly 2 doors down from the entry on the right. I share this room with another member of my team. My desk faces the doorway, meaning I can get a clear view out of the door we always leave open. So to the story. This incident happened a few weeks back. My colleague was out sick at the time, so I was in the office alone. I believe at the time only a couple of other members of staff were in the building at all, but it was so quiet it was hard to be sure. I was busy working away, answering some emails, when the light in the hallway suddenly turned off. This caught my attention, but I shrugged it off as all the lights in the building were motion sensors. No one had passed by the doorway for some time, so it did make sense it turned off. I spared a glance to the dark open doorway anyway, grimacing at how creepy the darkened hallways always looked. Looking away again, I went back to work. A few minutes passed by and the light turned back on. I looked to the doorway, expecting to see someone pass by, but several minutes passed and no one had walked by. I found this strange. Usually, the lights turning on were accompanied by footsteps or the sounds of someone's keys clinking in their pocket, as I always heard with the receptionist. I continued to stare at the open doorway. The light turned back off. Feeling a bit creeped out, I went back to work. Fast forward about an hour later, I was in the small kitchen making myself a cup of hot tea. With drink in hand, I started to head back to my desk. As I passed by the door that led into the building, I suddenly felt a chill run up my spine. Then the hallway light turned off again, plunging me into semi-darkness. Using my free hand, I frantically waved at the light, hoping to get it to turn back on. I could not see anything in that corridor with me, but I could feel a presence. It was close by, managing to evade my sight. Luckily, my waving worked, and the light came back on, but now the door to the building stood open. This made no sense. It was a swing door, which should swing closed when you let go of it, unless you propped it open. I sat my tea down on the floor and moved closer to the doorway to investigate. 3 pieces of paper had been wedged under the door. I leaned down to pull them out, and the door swung shut again. I headed back to my desk to read these notes. Each was a torn scrap from a pad of paper, much like the one that was currently sat on my desk. On each piece of paper was a single word, scrawled in small, messy handwriting. "I'm still here." I shivered as I read those words aloud. Who or what was still here? I never showed the notes to anyone else, and I now keep my office door closed, forcing people to knock before entering. Nothing has happened since that day, but occasionally I do get the shivers whenever I'm alone in the office. Haunting at the Children's Shelter, from Billy Towers. A warning to the faint of heart. This story involves the topic of child abuse. The story takes place when I used to work the night shift at a children's shelter. This shelter was a large 3-floor, 4-bedroom house. The upstairs area was where the bedrooms were, with the kitchen and living room on the first floor and a basement. The shelter functioned as a safe house for kids in foster care, children who were taken from their guardians for one reason or another. They would be sent here until their parents got custody back or the child was situated with a foster parent. The story of each of the kids there was enough horror on its own. They ranged from being neglected for days on end because their guardians were on substances, to children who were abused in every imaginable way, with no one to protect them. Each child had been through their own version of hell, and because of this, each had their own behavioral problems. As if the horrible stories and scary actions of each child weren't enough, it was a long-held belief that the shelter itself was haunted. What exactly haunted the shelter was and still is up for debate. The children claimed there was a shadow monster that stalked the halls and watched to see if you were bad. The staff had their own theory, however, that the children brought the dark energy of their lives and experiences along with them, and the energy just stayed. Either way, the shelter, more often than not, was an unnerving place. As I said before, I worked the night shift at the shelter. This meant coming in around 10 at night and leaving at 6 a.m. During this shift, it was my responsibility to deep clean the common areas, make breakfast and lunch for the next day, as well as make sure the kids were safe and sleeping. If I finished early enough, I spent the rest of my shift in the upstairs lounge, playing on my phone and checking on the kids every 15 to 20 minutes. During one of these shifts, I was texting my friend about our shelter ghost, making a joke of it. He warned me that such entities should be taken seriously, and making light of them can have consequences. I laughed it off and made another joke. This would be the last mistake I made that night. As soon as I sent the text, suddenly my phone lost service. I knew it wasn't a payment issue. I had just gotten paid the day before, and my phone bill was always the first thing I paid. I made a test call to my mom to see what the issue was. Instead of the normal dial tone or sending me straight to the service line, I got static on the other end. I hung up, and before I could try again, I got a call from a number that looked nothing like anything I've seen before. I went ahead and answered it. There was a strange, static-filled voice on the other end. I tried to speak to whoever it was, only to receive whispers. "Hello?" I said in a hushed tone. Then an abrupt and angry voice came back.
Get out!
Being screamed at by whoever or whatever was on the call, I immediately dropped my phone. When I finally caught my breath and my heart stopped beating out of my chest, I reached down and grabbed my phone to see that I had my service back. Right away, I texted my friend to tell them of the experience and to say that I would be more careful. From what I heard on the news the next day, there was a series of solar flares that week, which were said to interfere with cell reception and cause strange signals. Whether that was the case or not, I was much more respectful of the energy of the shelter from that day forward. I continued to work at the shelter for another 6 months, until it eventually was shut down. I wonder whether the uneasy energy of that shelter still clings to the walls. But to this day, I'm too unnerved by my experiences to go back and find out. Livewire. From Chai. I was working at a plant in the spring of 2010, manufacturing car parts at the time, from the carpets to the wiring. I was a carpet tech for the Honda section, and a close friend of mine was an electrical engineer in the same section. We worked closely together most days. The production lines were often nearly back-to-back in the cramped area. Austin, who was working on the wiring for the window panels at the time, was telling me what had happened to one of the line workers who had been gone for a week by then, and why he had a massive safety meeting later that day. Now, I had just come back from vacation from the lovely Carolinas, so I had not witnessed this firsthand, but it was an absolutely massive issue in the plant. So, a younger line worker named Felix had just started 2 months prior, and he was very friendly and helpful. He quickly became liked by our coworkers. He was in charge of testing the wires, and often used a car battery to power the wires and give them a test. Most days he was following OSHA standards: rubber gloves, rubber overcoat, eyeglasses, the whole 9 yards. Unfortunately, he had forgone most of that one day because the plant had reached a humid 98 degrees Fahrenheit. And honestly, when it gets like that, it feels even hotter, what with all the bodies around you. So it made sense when he ditched the protection to save himself from overheating, and he'd always been careful up to that point. Something must have made sense to him about that. He'd went to plug in the wires to the battery setup, and his hands were slick with sweat. He apparently went up in sparks and had been unable to let go of the wires. It took my friend and some other coworkers to shut off the battery and move him from the station. At that time, paramedics had been called, and it was very evident he was no longer breathing. Austin performed CPR the full 10 minutes until they made it to the plant, and he watched over him until he was loaded into the ambulance. He had to fill out all the forms on what happened, and apparently even had to tell the higher-ups. Well, his quick work ended up saving Felix. It took a full half hour of working on him to get everything started again, but the doctors said he was massively brain damaged, and it was unlikely he would ever be the same afterwards. He had severe burns covering most of his body, and he had to have his right eye replaced. Honestly, he was a mess, but he was alive. Our supervisor arranged a fund for his family to cover expenses, and while they did raise $21,000, it was a startling reminder of how important it is to follow protocol. Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an EerieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at EerieCast.com.